In a cold, silent sea in New Guinea, an overturned canoe drifts alone, trapped by hidden currents and lurking dangers. On top of it, two men, shivering and terrified, kneel on the surface, gripping the edges with all of their strength. But with dehydration closely approaching, one of the men musters up the strength to stand up and stares at the distant jungle coastline miles away. He takes off his tattered shirt and with a deep breath, he jumps, disappearing into the vast and treacherous waters. The man is Michael Rockefeller, billionaire heir to the most powerful family in America. But unbeknownst to them, this would be the last time he would ever be seen. Michael Clark Rockefeller was born into American royalty. His great-grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Sr., had built the Standard Oil empire and become America's first billionaire in 1916. His father, Nelson Rockefeller, was the Republican governor of New York and future vice president under Gerald Ford. The Rockefeller name was synonymous with power, influence, and unimaginable wealth. By 1961, the family fortune was so incredibly vast that there was nothing more money couldn't buy. Michael grew up in a world of private schools, high society galas, and expectations of following the family's well-trodden path of business or politics. But Michael was different. Even though he excelled at school and was the head of the student parliament, he was quiet, artistic, and introspective, with a deep passion for photography and visual arts. He wanted something beyond boardrooms and campaign trails. As one acquaintance put it, he wanted more out of life than four walls in an office building. At Harvard University, Michael earned degrees in history and economics, graduating in 1960. After a brief stint in the US Army, his family expected him to take his place in the Rockefeller business empire. Instead, Michael chose a radically different path. The seeds of Michael's destiny were planted in 1929, when his grandmother Abby founded the Museum of Modern Art in New York. His father Nelson became the museum's first director, but Nelson harbored a particular fascination with what was then called primitive art, the wooden masks, sculptures, and carvings created by indigenous cultures around the world. In 1954, Nelson Rockefeller met with the curators of the museum with one request: opening an exhibition for the primitive arts, but the curators laughed at his idea and called him mad, with Nelson leaving the meeting embarrassed. But on October the 20th, 1957, Nelson Rockefeller, with his son Michael by his side, stood in front of a large crowd of photographers, journalists, and art enthusiasts. He gave a rousing speech before opening the doors to his new creation, the Museum of Primitive Art. Inside the museum, young Michael Rockefeller stood amazed in front of the large sculptures. An idea immediately jumped to his mind. 3 years later, in February 1960, Michael Rockefeller sat at his desk, inking a letter intended for Robert Gardner from Harvard's Peabody Museum. He opened the letter by explaining his passion for art, and at the end of the letter, Michael put to paper the one wish that would seal his fate forever. "I wish to join an ethnographic expedition to document the mysterious tribes of New Guinea." Michael Rockefeller put down his camera and pressed his face against a small aircraft's window, staring down at a landscape that seemed frozen in time. Below him stretched the Baliem Valley, a magnificent vastness of green valley floor surrounded by mountains rising over 10,000 feet. "The tones are ever-changing in the shifting light," Michael wrote in his journal. "The mountains are constantly hidden and altered by the clouds that gather above them. The valley floor is broken into fragments by streams, hills, and the handmade barriers of the Dani people." Michael had joined Harvard's expedition to film dead birds, a documentary about the Dani people who lived in New Guinea's highlands. The project aimed to capture one of the world's last Stone Age societies before modernization changed them forever. The Dani tribes lived in a constant state of warfare, following ancient codes of honor and revenge. Death and war were woven into their everyday existence. Every day, the warriors waited for their enemies to attack, but never during rain, which would wet the feathers adorning their heads, and never at dusk, when evil spirits roamed the villages. Michael had read countless books about the Dani tribes and was adamant about studying them in person. Michael's official role on the expedition was recording sound, but he found himself far more interested in photography. He would spend hours observing their customs, documenting their daily lives with his camera. April 5th, 1961. Director Robert Gardner called Michael into his tent. Frustrated with Michael's lack of focus on his assigned duties, Gardner scolded him aggressively and reminded him of his official role as sound engineer. But Michael leaves with his camera in hand, intent on following through with his mission. For Michael, this wasn't just an academic exercise, it was a calling. He felt more alive in these remote jungles than he had ever had in New York's elite circles. By September, Michael was tired, and so was taking a break from work on the Dani project. He ventured south, trotting through the jungle to New Guinea's coastal lowlands. Deep into the jungle, Michael witnessed massive wooden poles that made him pause in awe. But as he ventured further and further through the trees and primitive tents, he encountered a new kind of tribe adorned with black and red body paint, feathers, and bone ornaments. Michael had made contact with the Asmat people. The Asmat lived in a vast swampy region of Dutch New Guinea, scattered across about 65 villages built on stilts because the coastal territories flooded during high tides. They were master woodcarvers who created towering sculptures called bish poles, intricate totems that could reach 20 feet in height. But these weren't mere decorations. The bish poles served a sacred purpose in Asmat cosmology. They contained the souls of warriors killed in battle. Until those deaths were avenged through reciprocal killings, the spirits remained trapped in the wooden sculptures, unable to find peace. To Michael, encountering his first bish pole was like discovering the Sistine Chapel. The sculpture which the people here produce is some of the most extraordinary in the primitive world. Equally as remarkable as the art is in fact that the culture which produces it is still intact. Michael became obsessed. This was art that could rival anything in the world's greatest museums, created by people who still lived according to ancient traditions. Michael saw an opportunity to bridge two worlds, to bring Asmat masterpieces to Western audiences, while ensuring the artists received proper recognition and compensation. The next month in August, the expedition was officially over, and Michael was back in his massive room in the Rockefeller mansion. He felt unfulfilled, walking up and down the room like a madman, going through his photos and journals scattered everywhere. After a few hours of thinking, he made a decision that would change his life forever. He would return to New Guinea alone to collect Asmat art for his father's museum. Michael flew back to New Guinea with René Wassing, a Dutch anthropologist who would serve as his guide and cultural interpreter. This time, Michael came prepared with a proper expedition boat, a 40-foot catamaran made from two dugout canoes lashed together with an outboard motor. But first, he needed to understand exactly what he was getting himself into. Through countless books and documents, Michael learned that the Asmat people lived in a universe governed by spirits. They believed that nothing happened by accident. Every death, every illness, every misfortune was caused by enemy action or dark magic. This worldview created an endless cycle of reciprocal violence. Every death had to be avenged with an equal death, or the spiritual balance of the community would remain disturbed. Headhunting wasn't random savagery, it was a sacred obligation. When Asmat warriors killed an enemy, they would remove the head and long bones, which were then carved into daggers, fishing spears, or kept as trophies. 3 years before Michael's return, a tragic incident had occurred that would ultimately seal his fate. On February the 8th, 1958, a Dutch patrol led by Administrator Max Lapre arrived at the village of Oostjenepe to enforce the colonial ban on headhunting. The encounter went catastrophically wrong. Amidst confusion, fear, and language barriers, Dutch officers opened fire on a gathering of Asmat men. At least 5 important village leaders were killed, men named Farat Sham, Ossum, Akon, Samut, and Ipi. This massacre devastated the Oostjenepe community. Under Asmat tradition, those deaths cried out for vengeance. The spirits of the slain would not rest until their killers were killed in turn. But Oostjenepe had no way to strike back at the distant Dutch colonial authority. In response, the village erected 7 new bishpoles in memory of their fallen leaders, a permanent reminder that the deaths remained unavenged. In Asmat culture, revenge has no time limit. They could wait years, even decades, for the right opportunity. These were the exact poles that caught Michael Rockefeller's eye. Michael had no knowledge of the 1958 incident when he arranged to purchase the 7 bishpoles from Oostjenepe. He saw only their artistic beauty and cultural significance. The villagers, after accepting his trade goods, promised to deliver the poles to him later. Michael was overjoyed with the arrangement. "Finally, I have a chance to acquire something of proper value," he wrote. If he could bring back truly significant artifacts, perhaps his parents would support his passion for anthropology instead of forcing him into a corporate career. He dreamed of adventures, of visiting remote tribes in search of curious artifacts. The boring office job that awaited him in New York seemed like a prison compared to the freedom he felt in New Guinea's jungles. Throughout October, Michael worked methodically, cataloging finds and shipping artifacts back to America. By November, he was ready for one final expedition to collect the promised bishpoles and explore even more remote villages. It would be the journey that cost him everything. Michael and Renee Wassing prepared for what was meant to be a routine collection trip. They prepared a boat that would take them to their destination, the village of Oostjenepe, where 7 magnificent bishpoles awaited pickup. The journey would take them along the Eilanden River and its tributaries, treacherous waters even in good weather. Their boat was the 40-foot catamaran with improvised pontoons for stability. It was narrow and low to the water, designed for river travel but forced to brave coastal seas. Most critically, it lacked a radio. Accompanying them were 2 young Asmat men, Simon and Leo, who served as guides and translators. The plan was simple: sail to Oostjenepe, load the bishpoles, and return to base before the weather turned. As the 4 men traveled approximately 3 miles offshore, disaster struck. Renee could hear the heavy winds and waves getting stronger, and right before he could run to Michael to warn him that they should head back, the catamaran was suddenly swamped by waves and capsized, dumping all 4 men into the churning Arafura Sea. The overturned hull created an air pocket that kept it afloat, providing something to cling to. But the men were miles from shore in rough waters, with no means of communication and no immediate prospect of rescue. Hours passed with no help in sight. Michael and Renee were terrified. They kept silent and spent the hours looking to the sky, praying to God to save them. The 2 Asmat guides, on the other hand, made a crucial decision. Being strong native swimmers familiar with these waters, they believed they could reach shore and alert others. They did not bother giving a warning before jumping into the water though, leaving Michael and Renee alone with the wreckage. Michael Rockefeller and Renee Wassing spent a terrifying night clinging to their overturned boat. The young heir, who had grown up with every possible luxury, now found himself in the most primitive struggle imaginable. Man against nature, fighting for survival. As dawn broke, the 2 men had been in the water for roughly 36 hours. The waters were now still, but with no land for miles around them, there was no sign of rescue. The boat was gradually sinking lower, and both men were weakening from exposure and dehydration. Unbeknownst to them, the Asmat guides had reached land. Exhausted and weakened, they managed to ask for help from the other tribes, but coordinating a search in this remote region took time. Michael, athletic and driven, was unwilling to drift helplessly any longer. Somewhere between 7 and 8 a.m., on top of the overturned boat, Michael proposed what seemed like their only hope. He would swim for shore himself, while Renee stayed with the wreckage to await rescue. Renee begged him not to go. The distance was enormous, at least 10 miles, possibly 12 or more depending on currents. The Arafura Sea was notorious for its hidden currents and tidal flows. And then there were the predators, sharks and crocodiles lurking beneath the surface less than 5 miles from the boat. But Michael had made up his mind. He stripped down to his underwear, tied 2 empty jerry cans to his waist for buoyancy, and gathered a hunting knife and a compass. Looking back at Renee one final time, he spoke those haunting last words, "I think I can make it." Renee Wassing watched his companion slowly recede into the distance, 3 dots bobbing between the waves in a line toward shore. Then, Michael vanished from sight into the vastness of the sea. It was the last time anyone from the civilized world would see the young billionaire again. Renee Wassing had spent all night shivering on top of the overturned boat. For hours, the only sound in the vast ocean was his teeth chattering and him rubbing his arms and shoulders together for heat. His mouth was dry and he could barely move on the boat. The next day, Wassing struggled to open his eyes to the shining sun above. Hearing a strange rattling noise around him, he tried to push his body against the boat's surface to stand. The rattling sound got closer and closer until Renee adjusted his eyes enough to see a massive Dutch search plane in front of him. The plane lowered a rescue boat and pulled him from the water. He was sunburned, dehydrated, but alive. His first words to his rescuers, "Where's Michael?" When they told him no one else had been found, the gravity of the situation hit like a thunderbolt. The heir to the Rockefeller fortune was missing in one of the most dangerous regions on Earth. News of Michael's disappearance sent shockwaves from New Guinea to New York. This wasn't just a missing person, this was a Rockefeller. Within hours, Nelson Rockefeller was on a plane to New Guinea with Michael's twin sister Mary, ready to personally oversee the search effort. The scene at Merauke, their base of operations, was surreal. International journalists swarmed the small coastal town. Photographers captured images of Nelson Rockefeller, sleeves rolled up, looking haggard but determined as he briefed the world's media on the search efforts. What followed was one of the most extensive manhunts ever seen in the South Pacific. Dutch colonial authorities, joined by Australian forces and local volunteers, scoured land, sea, and sky. Navy patrol boats combed the coastline. Helicopters and airplanes crisscrossed above the swamps and river deltas. Thousands of Asmat villagers paddled their canoes through labyrinth creeks, peering under logs and along muddy banks for any sign of the missing American. It was an unprecedented mobilization of resources in an incredibly challenging environment. 4 days into the search, one of the rescue workers ran up to Nelson Rockefeller on the beach with a rusty flotation canister in hand. It was Michael's. Nelson immediately made the connection and looked up to the sky with a sigh of relief. For Nelson Rockefeller, this discovery sparked hope. Perhaps his son had made it to land after all, but hope was all they had. Despite the massive search effort involving thousands of people, no other trace of Michael was found. No body, no clothing, no gear. It was as if he had simply evaporated. The search area was unimaginably hostile. Crocodiles and sharks patrolled the waters. The jungle was virtually impenetrable, a maze of rivers, swamps, and dense vegetation where a person could disappear forever just yards from a search party. After 9 days of searching, Dutch Interior Minister announced to the assembled media, there is no longer any hope of finding Michael Rockefeller alive. Nelson Rockefeller and Mary flew back to New York. By early December, the Dutch called off the active search altogether. Michael Rockefeller was eventually declared legally dead in 1964, with the official cause listed as presumed drowning. The explanation was simple and plausible. A young man had overestimated his swimming ability and had been claimed by the unforgiving sea. The Arafura Sea's powerful currents, combined with the distance and predators, made survival virtually impossible. But even as the official search ended, whispers of another possibility began circulating among those familiar with the region. While the world accepted the drowning explanation, 2 Dutch missionaries sat in a tent in Asmat territory when 2 priests, Father Hubertus von Pige and Father Cornelius van Kessel, entered. They both spoke fluent Asmat and had lived among the tribes for years. They sat the 2 missionaries down and revealed information that would make their blood run cold. According to multiple villagers from Oostjenep and nearby settlements, local hunters had encountered a lone white man swimming near shore on November 19th. He was exhausted but alive, wearing only his underwear, exactly matching the description of how Michael had entered the water. The tribesmen pulled him from the sea, but then a fierce debate erupted among the warriors about what to do with their unexpected captive. Some argued the man should be spared, others insisted he must be killed. To understand why they would contemplate murdering a helpless stranger, one must grasp the Asmat system of reciprocal justice. The village of Oostjenep had unfinished business in their spiritual ledger. The 1958 massacre had left 5 of their leaders dead, and their souls remained unavenged. Under Asmat tradition, every death had to be repaid with an equal death. It didn't matter that Michael personally had nothing to do with the 1958 incident. In their worldview, he was a member of the same tribe, white colonizers, who had murdered their people. According to the accounts gathered by both missionaries, several Oostjenep warriors, reportedly relatives of the men killed in 1958, decided that Michael's arrival was wrong time, wrong place for him. The stories described how Michael was first wounded non-fatally, stabbed in the ribs or abdomen with a spear. He was then transported by canoe to a secluded spot among the Jawor River, where the execution was completed. What followed was carried out according to ancient Asmat ritual. Michael was beheaded, and his body was divided among approximately 15 warriors. His skull was kept as a sacred trophy. His long bones were carved into daggers and fishing spears. His brain was consumed by the village elders in a ceremony believed to transfer his strength and spirit to the community. The accounts were remarkably consistent across multiple villages. Independent sources corroborated key details: the timing, the location, the specific men involved, even the distribution of body parts. The missionaries were astonished by the specificity. Father van Kessel was so convinced by what he heard that he wrote in a December 15th report, "It is certain that Michael Rockefeller was murdered and eaten by Oostjenep. This was revenge for the shooting 4 years ago." Faced with such shocking information, the missionaries felt torn between moral duty and political reality. They knew they should alert Michael's family, but they also understood the catastrophic consequences if this became public knowledge. The Dutch colonial administration was under intense international pressure to relinquish New Guinea to Indonesia. They were desperately trying to prove they had modernized and stabilized the territory. Admitting that a prominent American had been cannibalized under their watch would be politically disastrous. The missionaries passed their reports up the chain to Dutch colonial authorities. By late December 1961, just weeks after the official search ended, the Dutch government had detailed testimonies strongly indicating Michael Rockefeller's murder. What happened next was a systematic cover-up. Dutch officials ordered the missionaries to keep silent. Letters from church superiors warned that this issue was like a glass cabinet, extremely delicate, and that if word leaked, the mission's standing with the Asmat could shatter. Father van Kessel was quietly sent back to the Netherlands a few months later. When rumors did leak to the press in March 1962, the Dutch Foreign Ministry flatly denied them, claiming that they had been thoroughly investigated and found baseless. It was a lie. The investigation was only just beginning, and it was being conducted in absolute secrecy. An undercover Dutch investigator, Wim van der Waal, who knew the Asmat language and had actually sold Michael his boat before the fatal voyage, entered the Oostjenepe village. The other villagers were wary of him at first, and some preferred to keep their distance from him. However, for 3 months, van der Waal integrated into village life, helping the villagers with cooking, hunting, cleaning, and crafting. Bit by bit, van der Waal earned their trust enough to sit down with a group of the village leaders one night around a campfire and inquired about the mysterious white man that had vanished. The villagers immediately started telling van der Waal the story, and it was exactly what the missionaries had heard. One day, villagers showed up to van der Waal's tent and presented him with a human skull, one without a lower jaw and bearing a telltale hole in the temple, consistent with how the Asmat removed and consumed the brains of the headhunted victims. The implication was unmistakable. This was the skull of a white man that they had killed. Van der Waal also gathered specific names of the perpetrators and detailed accounts of how Michael's remains had been distributed among the warriors. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also damning for the Dutch colonial authority. Incredibly, the Dutch government chose to quietly archive these findings. Van der Waal was never asked to file a formal report or to go public. The information was deemed politically sensitive due to the delicate state of Dutch-Indonesian negotiations and Nelson Rockefeller's prominence in American politics. The official Dutch position remained unchanged. Michael Rockefeller's fate was unknown, presumably drowned at sea. But behind closed doors, those in power were nearly certain he had been killed by Oostjenepe warriors and cannibalized in a ritual act of vengeance. Eight years after Michael's disappearance, journalist Milt Macklin was adamant about solving the Rockefeller mystery. His goal was traveling to the Asmat region and filming as much footage as he could, hoping to find Rockefeller among the tribes. Macklin put a large production team together and flew out to Papua New Guinea. For days on end, Macklin and his team traversed the rough terrain, taking pictures and filming hours upon hours of footage of the nature, the people, and their culture. However, after a few weeks of tireless effort, Macklin decided to give up, knowing that there was no way he would find Rockefeller alive. He flew back to England and rented a storage facility where he stored dozens upon dozens of film reels, refusing to even go through them. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the Rockefeller case captured public imagination. Leonard Nimoy's TV series, In Search Of, devoted an episode to pondering Michael's fate in 1978. Books and articles floated theories ranging from credible to absurd. He was kidnapped by pirates, swallowed by quicksand, or living under an alias somewhere. Behind the scenes, the Rockefeller family never stopped quietly looking for closure. Unconfirmed reports suggested that Michael's mother hired a private investigator who traveled to New Guinea in 1979. According to journalist Paul Toohey, this investigator traded for several human skulls from local people, skulls purportedly from white men the tribe had killed. The investigator allegedly brought 3 skulls back to New York, convinced one was Michael's. Mary Rockefeller supposedly paid a reward of up to $250,000 for solid proof of her son's fate. If such an exchange happened, the family has never commented on it, and no forensic identification was ever made public. October 2007. Filmmaker Fraser C. Heston enters a storage unit in New York, once belonging to famous journalist Milt Macklin. Heston searched through crates of dusty film reels that had been unopened since 1969, before deciding to take all of them. Back home, he watches through hours upon hours of footage shot by a documentary crew investigating various Asmat cultures in New Guinea. Most of the film showed routine tribal activities: fishing, hunting, daily village life. But after hours of watching with a mess of food plates, coffee cups, and cigarette butts all around him, Heston's eyes fell upon one brief shot that made him instantly stop the projector and rewind. The sequence showed a war canoe full of Asmat warriors paddling down a river. Among the muscular, dark-skinned tribesmen sat one figure who stood out dramatically. A naked, bearded white man with glasses participating in what appeared to be a tribal ritual. The Asmat generally have very little facial hair, making the presence of a heavily bearded man with lighter skin extremely unusual. The film quality was poor, but the resemblance to Michael Rockefeller was undeniable. At this point, dawn was breaking. Heston was still inside, rewinding the footage over and over, pausing and examining it closely before jotting down in his notebook, this shot of a bearded, light-skinned Caucasian paddling in a canoe full of naked Asmat warriors begs more questions than it answers. The resemblance to Michael Rockefeller is obvious. Had Michael somehow survived? Had he been adopted by the tribe rather than killed? The footage sparked wild speculation about the missing heir living as a white native in the jungle. Photographer Malcolm Kirk, who shot the original footage, was skeptical of the Michael theory. He recalled encountering an albino Asmat man during his trip, a rare but documented condition that could explain a white-looking tribesman without requiring a lost Rockefeller. Still, the footage became a crucial piece of the puzzle, suggesting that until proven otherwise, the possibilities of Michael's survival couldn't be completely ruled out. Half a century after Michael's disappearance, journalist Carl Hoffman decided to retrace the story from scratch. In the village of Pirian, Hoffman met men related to those from Ostianeb, who still kept alive the tale of the outsider's death, albeit guardedly. Despite 5 decades having passed, the basic story remained consistent across multiple sources. Elders recounted how a handful of warriors had argued over killing Michael in revenge for the 1958 incident, ultimately deciding to do it. The collective memory even recalled a supernatural aftermath. Shortly after Rockefeller's killing, the Asmat coast was swept by a cholera epidemic that killed approximately 70 people. The villagers believed that this was retribution from the spirits for slaying the foreigner. This belief had made them deeply fearful of discussing the incident. They thought speaking of it could bring further curses or punishment. In one chilling encounter, as Hoffman was wrapping up a village visit, an old man performed what seemed to be a ritualized warning. The man enacted a sort of dance or pantomime of killing, then delivered an eerie monologue in the Asmat language. Hoffman's video camera captured the entire performance. When translated, the man's words were terrifying. "Don't you tell this story to any other man or any other village. Don't speak. If you tell it to them, you'll die. Your people will be dead if you tell this story. This story is only for you. If you tell it, you'll die." It was as if the village was placing a curse on the truth, desperately hoping to ensure it stayed buried. To Hoffman, this extraordinary warning confirmed just how taboo the subject remained. By the end of his investigation, Carl Hoffman had assembled a remarkable chain of evidence spanning 50+ years, from 1961 to 2012. Multiple independent sources, Dutch priests, patrol officers, Asmat villagers, and anthropologists all told variations of the same core story when pieces were assembled together. Hoffman's conclusion was unequivocal. The Asmat people, whose art and culture Rockefeller loved and respected, are the same people who most likely killed and ate him. However, while this was the prevalent theory for years, one anthropologist and linguist had worked in New Guinea for years and became accustomed to the culture and language. With his years of direct interaction with the Asmat people, he learned that in their language, to eat does not always translate literally, but more likely meaning to absorb, often used metaphorically to describe absorbing one into a tribe ritually, as in allowing them to join. The term was also often used with women and children who were captured from nearby villages and forced to join the rank of the victors. And so, with no evidence ever found to prove his demise, and the consistent tales that may have been misunderstood, perhaps the man that was destined for a life chosen for him by his lineage managed to break free and live out his dreams of experiencing such a culture firsthand. Perhaps Michael Rockefeller found where he was meant to be.